The wind carried the smell of blood before Hannah Whitfield ever saw the man lying face down in the dirt, and by the time she knelt beside him, one hand pressed hard against the bullet wound in his side, she had no idea that the dying stranger she was trying to save would one day place a diamond ring on her finger and call her the reason he still drew breath. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in the kind of second chances that only the Lord and the wide-open West can give a body, I ask you now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. The year was 1878, and the town of Sweetwater Ridge sat at the edge of the Wyoming Territory like a forgotten button on a torn coat sleeve. Hannah had come west 3 months earlier on the promise of a mail-order marriage to a rancher named Thomas Pruitt, a man she had never met but whose letters had spoken of a warm home, gentle cattle, and a kindness she desperately needed after burying both her parents to typhoid back in Ohio. But when her stagecoach rolled into Sweetwater Ridge, there was no Thomas Pruitt waiting at the depot. There was only a note, left with the station master, informing her that Thomas had changed his mind and married a widow from the next county over, and that Hannah was, in his words, no longer required. She stood there in her traveling dress, her trunk at her feet, 22 years old and utterly alone in a land that did not know her name, and she felt something in her chest crack clean in half. She had taken work where she could find it, scrubbing floors at the boarding house, mending shirts for the miners, anything that kept a roof over her head and food enough to keep from fainting. The townsfolk were not cruel, exactly, but they were not warm either. A woman abandoned before marriage was a curiosity, and curiosities were rarely trusted. She learned to keep her eyes down and her voice low, to move through Sweetwater Ridge like a ghost who had not yet accepted her own death. It was on one such evening, walking the long road back from the Hendricks farm where she'd been paid a few coins for laundry, that she heard the ragged breathing coming from the gully beside the trail. She almost didn't stop. Lord knows a woman alone in the territory had every reason to keep walking past trouble. But something, she would later call it the hand of God, turned her feet toward the sound, and there she found him, a tall man in a fine coat, now torn and soaked through with blood, his hat gone, his face pale as bone in the dying light. He had been shot twice, once through the shoulder and once low in the side, and whoever had done it had left him for dead in the brush like a piece of trash tossed from a wagon. Hannah did not know, kneeling there with her hands trembling and her skirt soaking up his blood, that the man's name was Nathaniel Cross, and that he owned more land and more cattle than any rancher in 3 territories. She only knew that he was alive, barely, and that if she left him there he would not see morning. She could not lift him alone, so she did the only thing she could, she pressed her shawl hard against the wound in his side, spoke to him in a steady voice though her own heart was hammering fit to burst, and prayed aloud as she had not prayed since her mother's funeral. When his eyes fluttered open for just a moment, unfocused and glassy with pain, she told him he was not going to die, not on her watch, not while she still had breath in her body to fight for him. Something in the ferocity of her own voice surprised her. She had spent 3 months believing herself discarded, unwanted, a woman nobody had bothered to claim. And yet here she was, refusing to let death claim this stranger either. It was old Ezra Coombs, a trapper who lived along the ridge, who came upon them by chance with his mule cart, and between the two of them they got Nathaniel loaded onto the flatbed and hauled him back toward town. Hannah rode alongside, her hand never leaving the wound, whispering scripture and encouragement in equal measure through the whole bone-jarring ride. Doc Hattersley, Sweetwater Ridge's only physician, was a tired old man with shaking hands, but he worked through the night by lamplight while Hannah boiled water and tore clean linens and refused every suggestion that she go home and rest. She did not know this man. She owed him nothing. But something about his stubborn grip on life, about the way his fingers had curled weakly around her wrist in the gully as if she were the only solid thing in his world, had lodged itself in her heart and would not let go. For 6 days Nathaniel Cross hovered between the living and the dead, fever raging through him like wildfire, and for 6 days Hannah barely left his bedside. She fed him broth a spoonful at a time when he could swallow. She wiped the sweat from his brow and sang the hymns her mother used to sing when Hannah herself had been sick as a child. She held his hand through the worst of the fever dreams, when he cried out names she did not recognize and fought against invisible enemies in his sleep. The town began to talk, of course. A woman alone tending a strange man around the clock was fodder enough for any frontier gossip mill, but Hannah found she no longer cared what Sweetwater Ridge whispered about her. She had already lost her intended husband, her reputation, and nearly her hope. She would not lose this fight too. On the seventh morning, Nathaniel opened his eyes and they were clear for the first time, fixed steadily on her face in the gray dawn light. His voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, but the words were plain enough. He asked her name, and when she told him, he said it was a fine name, a strong name, and that he owed her his life. Hannah, embarrassed and exhausted in equal measure, waved off his gratitude and told him to rest, that there would be time enough for thanks once he was strong. She did not yet know who he was. She did not know that Nathaniel Cross owned the Circle C Ranch, 40,000 acres of grassland running clear to the mountains, or that men in 3 counties tipped their hats when he rode past. She only knew a wounded man who needed tending, and she gave that tending freely, the way her mother had taught her that kindness ought to be given, without calculation, without expectation of return. The story of how Nathaniel Cross came to be shot in that gully was, as it turned out, a tale of greed and betrayal that ran deep into the roots of the territory. His own foreman, a hard-eyed man named Garrett Boone, had been skimming cattle from the Circle C for the better part of 2 years, selling them off to buyers in the next territory and pocketing the profit. When Nathaniel had grown suspicious and ridden out alone to inspect the herd counts, Boone had ambushed him on the trail, shot him twice, and left him for dead, intending to return later and make the whole affair look like the work of rustlers or renegades. It was only Hannah's chance passing, and the mercy in her heart that refused to walk on by, that had spoiled Boone's plan entirely. As Nathaniel's strength returned over the following weeks, he insisted on staying in Sweetwater Ridge rather than being moved back to the ranch, and though Doc Hattersley grumbled about the impropriety of it, Hannah continued to look after him, first out of medical necessity and then, though she scarcely admitted it to herself, out of something far warmer. They talked long into the evenings, about her childhood in Ohio and the parents she had lost, about his own hard climb from a penniless drifter to a man of considerable means, about the loneliness that seemed to follow them both like a shadow no amount of success or survival could shake loose. Nathaniel confessed that for all his land and cattle, he had never found a woman who wanted him for anything beyond his fortune, and that the sensation of being cared for simply because a stranger's conscience would not let her walk past a dying man was more precious to him than any deed to any acre he owned. Word eventually reached Sweetwater Ridge of who exactly Hannah had been nursing, and the town's opinion of her shifted overnight from suspicion to fawning curiosity, which Hannah found nearly as uncomfortable as the earlier scorn. She wanted no part of being chased after for proximity to Nathaniel Cross's fortune, and she said as much to him plainly one evening, telling him that she had helped him because it was right, not because she had known or cared what he was worth, and that she hoped he would not think less of her intentions now that the truth was out. Nathaniel, sitting up in bed with color finally returned to his face, looked at her for a long moment before saying that her not knowing was exactly why he trusted her more than any soul he'd met in a decade, and that a man in his position learned quick to tell the difference between those who wanted him and those who only wanted his money. But trouble was not finished with either of them. Garrett Boone, hearing that Nathaniel had survived and was recovering in town, grew desperate. A wounded man who lived to talk was a wounded man who could hang him, and Boone was not the type to wait quietly for a noose. He gathered 2 other hired hands who'd been complicit in the rustling scheme and rode into Sweetwater Ridge one moonless night with the intention of finishing what the gully had started. It was Hannah, restless and unable to sleep, who heard the horses approaching the boarding house and the low, urgent voices outside, and it was Hannah who woke Sheriff Amos Kearney with pounding fists on his office door before running back to warn Nathaniel and Doc Hattersley. What followed was the kind of reckoning the frontier dealt out plainly and without mercy. Sheriff Kearney, a broad-shouldered man who had worn the badge in Sweetwater Ridge for 11 years and buried more than one good deputy in that time, met Boone and his men in the street with his rifle already leveled, having roused 2 more townsmen to stand at his flank. Boone, seeing his ambush exposed and his advantage gone, made the fatal mistake of drawing anyway. The gunfight was brief and brutal, the kind that left the dust in the street stained dark and the night air ringing long after the shots had stopped. When it was over, Boone and one of his men lay dead, and the third had thrown down his weapon and confessed the whole scheme rather than face the same fate. Nathaniel, weak as he still was, had staggered from his sick bed with Hattersley's old shotgun in trembling hands, determined to stand beside the woman who had stood beside him, but the fight had ended before he ever reached the street, and Hannah found him collapsed against the boarding-house wall, more relieved than angry that his stubborn courage had arrived a few moments too late to get him killed twice in 1 month. In the weeks that followed, as autumn settled gold and rust-colored over the Wyoming grasslands, Nathaniel regained his full strength, and with it came a clarity about what he wanted from the remainder of his life. He rode out to the Circle C ranch to set his affairs in order, to bury his faithless foreman's schemes along with the man himself, and to look with new eyes upon the fortune he had built. It had all seemed to matter so much before, the acreage, the cattle counts, the standing his name carried in the territory. Now, having stared death in the face in a roadside gully and been pulled back by the hands of a woman who owed him nothing, he found himself measuring his wealth by a different scale entirely. He returned to Sweetwater Ridge not as a rancher come to collect his due, but as a man come courting, humble in a way his money had never required him to be before. He found Hannah at the boarding house, sleeves rolled and hands raw from washing linens for wages that barely covered her room, and he asked her to walk with him along the ridge where the cottonwoods were turning color against the pale autumn sky. There, with the whole wide territory spread golden beneath them, he told her plainly that he had thought long on what she had done for him, not just the nursing and the medicine and the sleepless nights, but the simple fact that she had knelt in the dirt beside a dying stranger when every reason of caution said to keep walking. He told her that a man could spend his whole life chasing land and cattle and the respect of other men, and never once find anything as rare as a heart willing to give itself away for nothing in return. And then, with the kind of plain-spoken honesty the frontier seemed to demand of its people, he asked if she might consider a second mail-order arrangement, this one made not through letters and strangers but through the truth of what they had already lived through together, and he asked if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. Hannah wept there on the ridge, the kind of tears that come only when a wound long carried finally finds its healing, and she told him that she had come west believing herself unwanted, discarded before she had even been given a chance, and that she had spent months certain God had forgotten to account for her in his plans. But kneeling in that gully, she said, she had understood for the first time that her life had purpose even when no man had claimed her for his own, and that whatever answer she gave him now, she wanted him to know she was not the same frightened, abandoned woman who had stepped off that stagecoach. She said yes not because he was rich, and not because he owned the Circle C and half the grassland from Sweetwater Ridge to the mountains, but because in the darkest, most desperate hour of his life, she had seen the truth of who he was, and it was a man worth loving. They were married that December in the small clapboard church at the center of town, Reverend Josiah Blackwood presiding over a ceremony attended by half of Sweetwater Ridge, including old Ezra Coombs, who liked to tell anyone who'd listen that he'd had a hand in saving the groom's life and expected to be remembered generously come Christmas. Sheriff Kearney stood near the back with his hat in his hands, and Doc Hattersley wept openly, claiming it was his old age and nothing more. Hannah wore a simple dress, no finer than what any rancher's wife might own, because she had insisted she wanted no gown that spoke louder than the vows themselves. Nathaniel, standing at the altar with the faint scars of Boone's bullet still visible beneath his collar, told her before God and the whole gathered town that she had saved his life twice over, once in a gully with her bare hands, and once again by teaching him what his life was actually for. Now, before we come to the end of this story, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are watching from tonight, whatever town or city or quiet corner of the world you call home, I would love for you to leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and tell me too what lesson this story stirred in your own heart. Was it the power of a single act of kindness? The truth that our worth is never measured by who chooses us or leaves us behind. Or maybe it was the reminder that second chances often arrive dressed as strangers in a ditch, waiting for someone brave enough to stop. Hannah and Nathaniel built their life together on the Circle C in the years that followed, and Hannah, who had once stood at a stagecoach depot believing herself the most unwanted woman in the territory, became known throughout the county not for her husband's fortune but for her own steady hand, nursing sick neighbors, taking in orphan children from the wagon trails, and never once turning away a stranger in need, because she remembered too well what it felt like to be the one left in the dirt. She often said, in the years when her hair had gone silver and her grandchildren gathered at her knee by the fire, that the Lord had not abandoned her on that stagecoach after all. He had simply been walking her toward a different road, one dustier and harder than she'd ever imagined, that led not to the husband she had been promised, but to the one she was always meant to find. If this story touched your heart even a little tonight, if it reminded you that kindness costs us something and gives back so much more, that faith carries us through even our darkest and loneliest hours, and that second chances are real and worth believing in, then please take a moment to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who might need these words today, and subscribe for more stories like Hannah and Nathaniel's. Thank you for riding along with me through this one, friends, and until next time, may you always have the courage to stop for the stranger in the ditch, because you never know whose life, and whose heart, you might end up saving.